ended up in London because of the military coup in my country. And the reason why this is relevant, hopefully, will be seen as I develop my paper. We go to the first one. I'll comment on this in a minute, but Latin America at the moment suffers from integrationitis. That's what I would call it. Everybody is integrating. There is regional integration of so many kinds. Central America, North America, South America, and so on. I'll come back to this later on. And this time round, these integrations seem to be very serious. It's not just a little proposal that lasts not much, like in the past we have had that. This time round, actually, the proposal is serious because Latin America is seriously integrating itself. And this integration has acquired a continental dimension. There is no question about it. Latin America as a whole, not every single country, but as a whole is moving in a particular direction with a particular type of policy. I would define that policy as poverty eradication plus economic growth. That's what it is. In other words, it is development of economic growth with equity as much as possible in the circumstances. The figures that everybody is given here regarding Brazil is a clear indication that this is what it's all about. If one were to look at the eradication of poverty and the figures in other countries, is similar. Although it's not as impressive as in Brazil in terms of volume, it is certainly impressive in terms of percentage. There's no question about it. One can pick up just any country one wants, but let's say the most clear examples. Whatever one may think about it, the fact of the matter is that Venezuela in 1998 has something like 70% poverty. Today the figure is about 25%. And this is only in 10, 12 years of redistribution of income through the use of the revenue of the country. When we're to look at, countries such as Bolivia will have similar situations. If one were to look at Central America, particularly countries such as Nicaragua and so on, one would see the same thing, Argentina and so on. So there is these dynamics. There is absolutely no question about it. The region is moving in a particular direction. And you go from this, all sort of other people actually have talked about this. Latin America was subjected to the worst aspects of neoliberalism. I think worse than, there's no other continent where the countries of that continent have been treated so badly and so systematically to the policies of neoliberalism for so long and so unalloyed, that is to say, with no mechanisms of valuation of poverty. It was totally brutal. And this came as a result of military dictatorships. Neoliberalism began actually in Chile in 1973. Some people say it began in Brazil in 1964. I think it began in Chile in 1973. When the military in Chile began to apply their model of economic policy, the policy was designed to weaken society and to impoverish people as a tool of social and political discipline. That's what it was. If you actually did not comply with the regime, and many of us didn't, you face the possibility of serious repression and serious retaliation at the individual level. But more than that, there was the possibility that you actually lose your income and your job for a long time to come. And that was an extremely sobering and disciplining factor. People did behave. And these military dictatorships in the case of Chile lasted for 17 years, in which they assassinated 10,000 people. So this was not a neutral, technical, economic policy process. This was a political process that had technical and economic consequences. That's the way to understand it. If one were to look at just a sort of very superficial comparison in this presentation today, one were to compare the implementation of neoliberal policies under Margaret Thatcher in Britain with the implementation of neoliberal policies in Chile, the differences are marked. Margaret Thatcher, for example, took 1 full year, 1984 to 1985, to be able to defeat the miners in order to impose some of the worst policies of the Thatcherite regime, which cannot compare in terms of being bad with what was implemented in Chile. In Chile, on the 11th of September 1973, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there was no opposition of any kind whatsoever, and the regime imposed anything it wanted for that moment. So the comparison doesn't bear, in fact, the two places would not bear comparison. The military in Chile were followed by similar regimes all over the place. In Argentina, in Uruguay, 1974, in Argentina, 1976, military dictatorship as well, and so on throughout the region. In the places where there was no military dictatorship, very authoritarian regimes actually were in place that quite terrible policies. I want to give you some sense of what that meant in those decades, particularly the 1980s to the 1990s. In Chile, the number of people that were assassinated in 17 years from 73 to 1990 was 10,000. In Argentina, 76 to 82 was 30,000. And in the case of Nicaragua, in the 80s, when there was a Sandinista regime and the US unleashed a war of attrition against them, 50,000 people were assassinated. In the case of Peru, in the war against terrorism, so-called, in the 1980s, 60,000 people were assassinated. In the case of El Salvador, in the civil war in El Salvador, 1980-1990, where the US was supporting the government, the death squad government of El Salvador, by giving them $1 million a day in military support, in order for them to actually stop the rebellion that was there. This lasted 10 years, 80,000 people were assassinated. And in Guatemala next door, exactly for the same reasons and using exactly the same policies, between 1980 and 1990, 120,000 people were assassinated. This is the scale of what we're talking about. People today are still digging out mass graves that were left as a legacy of this period. These were the preconditions for the system as a whole to be able to impose neoliberalism on the region. So it's quite brutal. And this is the result. Not only in terms of dead people, this is the result in terms of property. Everybody else showed some of this already. In 1990, there was 48.3% of poor people in the whole region, which was extremely high. This was regionally extremely unevenly distributed. In some places, you still even today have places such as Honduras, where the level of poverty in Honduras is 77, 80%. That's what it is. If you look at Bolivia today, Bolivia has got Evo Morales, which is applying policies of redistribution of income, improving the situation of the poor families. Systematically, nevertheless, the informal sector of the Bolivian economy is, even today, as we speak, 70%. That is the legacy of the past, because the tin industry was completely closed down by neoliberal considerations, and the labor movement and everything else literally disappeared. If we move to 2002, already by 2002 we have the beginnings of the Lula government. By then we have 4 years of Chavez government in Venezuela. Some policy alleviations have been, some measures have been taken. So the region as a whole, the poverty in the region as a whole goes a little bit down from 48 to 44%. But in 2002, 44% was actually 227 million people. That's a lot of people in the whole of the region. And it began to decline much more seriously after, government to government of the left or progressive were elected in Latin America, and they began to implement alternative policies to neoliberalism. And I know the figures for 2011 from the Economic Commission for Latin America. The levels of poverty, according to CEPAL, or Economic Commission for Latin America, in 2011 at the end is 30%. That is to say, there's been a serious decline of poverty in the region as a whole. You people have shown what's been going on in Brazil, but in the rest of the region it's quite impressive. If you take 1990, and then you take 2011, and you take that period, the decline in poverty has meant that something like 100 million people actually have been taken out of poverty in the region as a whole in that period. 100 million people is a lot of people, so it's quite impressive what is taking place. These give you the percentages, these give you the actual figures and so on. So what you have is a terrible legacy, which the Latin Americans are not only trying to address by having a specific alternative policies domestically, but they are complementing this, supplementing this by having policies that actually pervade the whole region. So if we move to the next one, this is just a sample of some of the people who have been elected. They're all non-traditional politicians, most of them.